Do you feel like you'll always have the indictment kind of hanging over you until there's someone else who's indicted?
Kudos to Ashley Flowers for asking this question. I suspect this was John's least favorite moment in the whole 90 minutes because it's addressing really the elephant in the room. And after she asked the question, John glances straight at the camera and then he gives this answer.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be, it's an unknown.
Is there any, does that mean anything now?
Fantastic question. The grand jury trial was actually the only legal process of any substance that took the Ramsey case by the horns and listened to both sides of it and made a call based on evidence presented over 13 months.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Does that mean anything now? Could somebody say, oh, we have this indictment from 30 years ago, we can still go charge John, or would they have to get a new grand jury indictment? Is it? I don't know how scary of a looming thing that is.
Yeah, I don't know.
Once again, at this point, John folds his arms. He actually does that a lot in this interview. And while Ashley asks him how the legal process might unfold, John says, I don't know. Well, I do know. I don't know if you need to be an expert on the law or just know the law or know this case. And it does have a tricky legal loophole here and there, but the legal case surrounding John Benet is nevertheless pretty straightforward. I'll share my assessment, part of it, in the final minutes of this analysis. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I have to say it's interesting observing a true crime creator with massive resources, the number of cameras and camera angles, the size of the crew, but also her skill in storytelling. But I think I counted 5 people in the room during Ashley's interview. That's besides herself and John, as well as multiple big-ass cameras. I've also watched the first quarter of what Ashley describes as a deep dive in the Ramsey case. Have you seen it? It's 3.5 hours long. It's fairly detailed. And while I was impressed with Ashley's storytelling and attention to detail, her systematic recall as well and her recall of times, I wasn't really blown away by it either. I do think it's very difficult in a case like this that has been spoken about so much by so many to tell the same story in a fresh way. And I think there is a way to do it, but it's not easy. It requires a lot of work, a shitload of digging, and also knowing this case back and forth, top to bottom, and 6 ways from Sunday. In any event, kudos again to the host for asking John a couple of tricky questions, and we're going to deal with 5 more of those now. So if you're finding this analysis worthwhile and meaningful, I mean from me, please do hit the thanks button. Bear in mind, I don't really do live streams, so if you want to show your appreciation, smash that button, and let's get started. Number 1, the 25th. Now, Ashley seemed to be very good at interacting with John in a friendly way, sometimes making jokes, getting him to relax, only for John to, in my opinion, occasionally misspeak. He seems to do that just before the 50-minute mark where Ashley jokes about Fleet White, and his name comes up quite a lot, getting aggressive, and her joking that she wonders why John didn't do the same thing, grab people by their collars to get answers about his daughter.
Makes you not be the Fleet who's holding onto people's collars.
And that is when John responds.
I've told people, look, if you were a male living in Boulder on the 26th or 25th of December 1996, suspect.
Well, that's not really accurate because I think John has excluded one particular male that was in Boulder that day, and I'm not referring to John himself. Like I said in the previous analysis, I think the 26th is the day we need to pay attention to, which is why John's correction here is perhaps worth noting. Anyway, number 2, John's huge red flag. What do you think it is? Well, it's Fleet. Now think about the situation. John is being interviewed by arguably the biggest podcaster, true crime podcaster in America. So saying something like, this is a huge red flag. Well, by doing that, he's got to know that he's setting a cat among the pigeons.
If that's true, that's a huge red flag.
And this is a reference to Fleet White opening the wine cellar door after Officer French. Now, really, is Fleet supposed to be a brand new suspect now? Because it is true. Fleet did do that. It's true that Fleet opened the wine cellar door, but it was completely dark, which prompted him to look for a light switch. He couldn't find it, so he closed the door. And it's an interesting reversal in a sense, because some have suggested John opened the same door. This was at about 1 p.m. and saw John Benet before he turned on the light. I think when John was questioned, he couldn't remember if he turned on the light or not. Steve Thomas asked him this directly. He said, and was the light, that's the light in the basement, that's the light inside the wine cellar, was that light on or off? John Ramsey answered, I think it was off. Steve Thomas, and did you turn the light on? John Ramsey, probably. I don't remember specifically turning it on, but probably would have. It's a dark room. Now, that's a seminal moment, ought to have been a seminal moment in John's life, the discovery of John Benet, if that is when that occurred, and he can't remember whether he turned the light on or not. Incidentally, this is how Lawrence Schiller describes this crucial moment in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Then Ramsey, with White a few paces behind, turned right into the boiler room. At the rear was a door leading to what the family called the wine cellar, a windowless room with brick walls. Ramsey pulled the door open toward himself, stood at the threshold, and, peering to the left into the darkness, saw a white blanket on the floor just as he reached for the switch on the wall to his right and turned on the light. Now, that is a very narrow sort of window between seeing John Benet and the light switch. The question is, which occurred first? Then he saw the two little hands sticking out from under the blanket. Oh my God, he cried. John Benet was lying on the floor, partly wrapped in the blanket. Her hands were extended over her head and appeared to be tied together. There was tape covering her mouth. From a distance of about 12 feet, Fleet White saw Ramsey enter the wine cellar and turn out of sight to his left. As Ramsey cried out a second time, White followed him into the room. By now, Ramsey had ripped the tape off his daughter's mouth and was untying the cord from around one of her wrists. White knelt beside Ramsey and touched one of John Benet's feet. The child was dead cold. Now, in this statement from Lawrence Schiller, who's always almost like kept the safe middle line in describing this case, he doesn't really say when Fleet White, or when or whether Fleet White saw John turn the light on. Now, from a prosecutorial perspective, this is a very important point, is this idea that if John didn't turn on the light and you couldn't see inside that wine cellar, then doesn't that suggest that John knew John Benet was there? And I think Lou Smith went down there separately to test this theory, and basically, because it's a very important legal point, and said that when he looked inside there, without turning the light on, he could see inside. And I think other detectives disagreed with him, but legally it's a very, very sensitive area. Now, interestingly, from the death of Innocence, that's not even mentioned. There's no reference whatsoever to turning on the light switch. John doesn't say when he turned it on or even if he turned it on. I mean, he goes through it really quickly. He says, we continue our search, and a few minutes later, I'm at the door by the furnace. I open it and see John Benet lying on the floor with a white blanket around her. Right? Now let's go to an excerpt from Foreign Faction by James Kolar. And this suggests that he had access perhaps to Fleet White's statements. Ramsey stated that both men got down on the floor to check for signs that the window hadn't been broken again. Preparing to leave the room, they moved a fireplace grate to check another closet, and Ramsey then moved out of the room and down the hallway toward the wine cellar. White was replacing the grate when he heard John Ramsey cry out, "Oh my God." White stated that he rushed down the short hallway, so John had gotten a bit of a lead in terms of, had left him a little bit behind. And then he joined Ramsey just as the latter flipped on the lights in the wine cellar. So, and I think this is quite interesting, certainly from Kolar's narrative, that he hears John cry, "Oh my God," and then he rushes down the short hallway and then sees the flicking of the light switch on. That's certainly according to this narrative. Number 3, Fleet felt like the investigation and grand jury was deliberately delayed. Was it? Now, there was a moment in the interview where John tells Ashley that him being in the Navy is irrelevant. That's this moment here.
What the
Were you in
sailboat?
the Navy?
Yeah, that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
Sure.
And I think this comes up when John says that how Fleet was a much better sailor than he was. And Ashley then says, "Well, weren't you in the Navy?" And so John then just sort of dismisses it. And I actually think John being in the Navy, which means he was in a conservative military family, and think about that and his ties to Lockheed, which is a defense contractor, also how that ties in with the typical kind of training and activities that one has when you're in the Navy, things like, and sailing, things like tying knots, and John's background as an Eagle Scout. I think all of that is relevant, but it's interesting how he directs the interview at times. And this is why, because of this directing of the interview, I want to redirect our attention to something about Fleet White that you may or may not be aware of. As John's best friend, Fleet was very au fait with what was going on with John's circumstances, for the lack of a better word. So when Fleet has the idea that everything is proceeding according to a plan,
because it's all part of the plan.
I mean, that seems to be a gut feeling, an instinct, a sense that Fleet seems to get while all of this is unfolding, right? Fleet seems to cotton on to the impression that a strategy, an underlying strategy was afoot. And I think he's right. And this was Fleet's position, and I tend to agree with it. This wasn't brought up by Ashley, but I do think it's worth looking into. Now, you can read about the details of what Fleet was getting at, what he felt was happening in an article on Romper dated 2016. That came out about the same time that the case of John Benet came out, before CBS was slapped with a lawsuit. But I'll put a link to that in the description. Now, if John didn't like Fleet much, Fleet had very strong feelings about his pal's potential culpability as well. And he seemed to do more than anyone else who wasn't in law enforcement to either get the case to trial, including getting it out of the hands of District Attorney Alex Hunter's, and he was trying to do this before Alex Hunter basically washed his hands off the case. So it's really interesting that Fleet White, I don't want to say predicted, but he certainly seemed to be aware of a potential sabotage or a potential just unraveling of the case, certainly in the legal sense. And he seemed to be aware of this ahead of time. And he accused the district attorney of dragging his feet while all of this was taking place in 97, 98, 99. And then after that, he tried really hard to publish the outcome of the grand jury hearing. And that was as early as 2014. That's 10 years ago. Look at this headline from Westword. John Benet case, Fleet White sues for release of grand jury documents accusing girls' parents. 1 year after the indictments were unsealed, the Whites, that's Fleet and Priscilla, sued to have the documents released, obviously unsuccessfully. Let's go a little bit deeper into this article from Westword. A prominent Boulder couple, former close friends of John and Patsy Ramsey, have filed a lawsuit seeking the full release of long-suppressed documents drafted by a grand jury investigating the 1996 murder of the Ramsey's 6-year-old daughter, John Benet. Now, I do think it would be in the public's interest to release those documents. Would certainly provide a lot of relief and closure to, I think, a lot of parties. but there is possibly a very good reason to not do so, is possibly to protect a particular individual. Now, last fall, going back to the article, a judge released 4 redacted pages from 18 pages of official action, documents prepared by the grand jury indicating that the panel had sought to indict John Benet's parents for felony charges resulting in death and on an accessory charge. But Fleet and Priscilla White contend that the remaining documents may also contain information the public is entitled to know. If Colorado law requires the disclosure of any information related to the grand jury's work, we want it out there, White says. This isn't some minor matter. It's the John Benet Ramsey homicide. Now, it's interesting that he refers to it as minor matter. There's also this article from the Daily Camera where John admitted arguing with White while being deposed. And this article from the Daily Camera goes into this whole thing of the breakdown of the relationship between Fleet White and John Ramsey. Now, actually, for quite some time there was mystery about this aspect, and then finally it came out in the media. It says Ramsey speaks at length about his relationship with White in his deposition. He talks about what he calls White's strange behavior. So his behavior is totally acceptable, talking about John Ramsey talking about his own behavior. And no, Fleet White's behavior is actually strange, and he criticizes him in this deposition for insisting that the Ramseys do a CNN interview days after the killing. Ramsey also speaks about his battle with tabloid reporters. Then there's another article, Fleet White claims bias in Ramsey case. But I want to come back to this whole thing about this argument between John and Fleet. Now, something John appears to have convinced Ashley about is this idea that it was absurd for Linda Arndt to suspect John during the kidnapping phase. Was Fleet White being absurd as well? Were the grand jurors absurd when they voted the way they did? Was Sergeant Reichenbach also absurd when he took officers aside? That was that morning, I think, in the parking lot, and he said the situation appeared a little hooky to him. Now, I do need to consult my notes, but I seem to remember Fleet was pissed off because John was in Atlanta giving an interview to CNN instead of talking to the cops in Boulder. Meanwhile, John's version of events is that it was Fleet's idea that John spoke to CNN, which to me sounds a little weird. And so can we do a little bit of research on this to find out what the truth is one way or the other? Now, maybe I missed something somewhere. Let's have a look at Schiller's account of the argument. In Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, he writes the following about this argument. What Patsy's sister Polly noticed at her parents' home, this is I think in Atlanta, was that Fleet White was quarreling angrily with her brother-in-law John. Patsy was standing to one side of them while Fleet hovered over John, telling him he had to go back to Boulder and help the police. It was wrong for him, according to Fleet, to hire his own investigators and criminal attorneys, said Fleet. His job was to cooperate with the police, not stonewall them. Then a little further down on the same page, his daughter had just been buried. How could Patsy and John even think about going on television? Even if they wanted to respond to rumors that were going around, a TV appearance was unthinkable. And so this seemed to be what Fleet White was arguing about. Why are you going on TV? Go back to Boulder, go and talk to the police. That's certainly Schiller's version of this argument. Now, what I've always felt was so unfair in this case is John giving countless interviews while Fleet has remained silent. And when Fleet has broken his silence, it's never to talk about the evidence or anything specific that he's seen, but basically what he does when he talks is perhaps accuse the district attorney or complain about the process to no avail. And the overall impact is that Fleet White had very little influence ultimately on the narrative, let alone control over it. Anyway, let's go on to the next point. Number 4. Did you ever ask Fleet why he called 911 on December 23rd? Now, as you've noticed, this analysis really focuses a lot on Fleet White, which, if you ask me, why are we talking about Fleet White at this point, almost 28 years after the fact? It's, to me, just barking up the wrong tree. Anyway, that is what we are doing. By the way, in the Netflix documentary, there's a lot of barking up the John Mark Carr tree, which tells you just how well the people who were involved in that production know this case? I mean, if you're going to even go down that road, it just tells you how little you know about or how outdated your understanding is of this case. Now, when John says he can't remember whether Fleet called 911 or a wrong number, and he can't remember whether the police came, well, I do. The police did come, and Susan Stein, that's the mother of Burke Ramsey's best friend, Doug, she basically intercepted them at the door. I think they were still behind the door, and basically they then left without entering. That's how I understand it. John Benet apparently cried earlier that same day. Now, when Ashley asked John if he ever asked Fleet about what actually happened that day, why did he call 911? Why didn't he just ask his best friend what happened? John glances at the camera and says no, he didn't ask Fleet White about that day.
What was the deal with the 23rd 911 call?
I meant to dial something else. I can't remember. I don't remember if the police came or they just called us back. But we said, no, that was a mistake, I guess.
Did you ever ask about it?
Ask Fleet?
Yeah.
No.
Something else I confirmed in this interview, which is a fascinating mismatch in terms of reasoning and storytelling, is that John confirms, certainly the way I read it, that he thinks the ransom note was written before the crime.
The person came into our home when we were gone that evening, went out for dinner, was there when we got home, and waited for us to go to bed.
Now, if you're going to come up with absurd scenarios, I think this is one of the most absurd, that you're going to hang out in a house with 4 people inside it. Well, if you can get in as easily as Lou Smith says, then why wouldn't you get in after the people are in the house and asleep? I mean, you stand a really real chance of bumping into someone who's running around, especially since you did have kids running around late at night, eating pineapple and whatnot. You stand a very real chance of being intercepted and getting into serious trouble. And how do you know that the dog isn't in the house either? But the point is, if John thinks that the ransom note was written before the crime, in other words, on Christmas night, in this long period that the intruder is essentially camping in the house, well, then the tomorrow in the ransom note could only have referred to the 26th, not the 27th. And I personally think it's a little disingenuous, if that is what you think, to review a narrative in an interview, but then keep it within the contrivance of what you thought at the time. Because in hindsight, obviously, you should have changed your mind. I mean, John should be saying now that both he and the cops ought to have noted there and then, at 10 a.m. on the 26th, that no call had been made. This should be the thing that is realized now, that could have been done differently, that should have been done differently. So when you're retelling the story, you don't stay within that mindset where you say, oh, is it tomorrow? Because today you know it wasn't tomorrow. Now you know it wasn't the 27th. Are you guys keeping up with me in terms of this reasoning? And so if that was the case, then we can say in hindsight, 10 a.m. comes, no call was made. What should they have done? They should have escalated the action. Either searched the house again then at 10 a.m. or got in the dogs, which were on standby, or questioned the Ramseys there and then. The kidnappers haven't called. Let's have a look at handwriting samples. Let's ask a couple of questions. By the way, where's Burke? What does he remember? Even go to the neighbors. Did you hear anyone scream, etc., etc.? And imagine if any of those interventions occurred at 10 a.m. that morning. That could have made all the difference. Then number 5, this wasn't about John Benet. At around about the 43-minute mark, while talking about John Douglas, Ashley asked John point blank, do you think you're the why? In other words, she's asking John if the killer's motive is directed at him. John's answer is perhaps one of the biggest whoppers we've ever seen in this case.
This wasn't about John Benet. That's John's assessment.
And you still believe that?
I think that's part of it.
Do you agree with John Douglas's assessment that this wasn't about John Benet? Because I don't. I mean, think about just the amount of detail in terms of the crime against John Benet. She had 2 very serious injuries. She had duct tape over her mouth. She had knots all over her hands, and there were other things going on as well. And after all that, you're going to say this wasn't about John Benet. I mean, I think John Benet's pageants, the focus on her appearance and her being sexualized the way that she was, are both very, very relevant. I think it was about John Benet. I also think John's business concerns were also very relevant at the time. And that is definitely another dimension to this and to the aftermath of the case, and arguably to the cover-up of the case. And John seems to be alluding to the same thing, that the perpetrator was almost like two people in one person. So first of all, someone who had a sexual motive, but also someone who had a bone to pick with his business. But to me, that is incompatible with a single perpetrator. Now, in my opinion, there wasn't a huge amount of critical thinking, not too many moments during the 90 minutes, but one that really stood out was actually pointing out the mixed motive of this case. Was it financial or sexual? This is a very important and interesting and necessary line of inquiry to take in the John Benet Ramsey case.
And like if you're greed, and going back to a lot of things the note said, what do you think the way that the sexual component to this and the way that they staged it, like why that piece of it? If it goes back to being about you and about money, like that's
I know, it doesn't make sense. I agree.
And John's response is, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Well, maybe one should make sense of it 28 years later. And it's interesting, John's body language at this point, he's actually got his hand in front of his face, kind of blocking out anyone, just for that moment. And I think it was definitely sexual. That's why I say, if you say, it wasn't about John Benet, how can it not be about John Benet and be sexual? Right? And that's obviously not alluded to in the ransom note, which is all about money and John's business. And I suspect the sexual narrative is a big reason why there was a ransom note to begin with. If you're going to talk about motive, I think you've got to be clear about how many perpetrators you have in mind and also which perpetrators you're referring to, because I don't think it's a one motive fits all situation. Ashley asked John whether the ransom amount was more of a message. It's an interesting question in a symbolic sense, and I'm not sure Ashley meant it in the way that John responded to it, because, I mean, a lot of what was contained in the ransom note was meant to trigger you into thinking something. It was meant to put you on a particular track, wasn't it? So it's also interesting how John licks his lips a moment after saying that the $118,000 number meant something to somebody. Oh, it certainly did, but that's really interesting in and of itself. Was that a symbol that was placed in there simply for its symbolic value? So there is also a financial motive here. You see, regardless of whether you think John was involved or not, he had to have been wary of ruinous financial damage from the PR shitstorm this was unleashing. I'm talking about in terms of Lockheed's position on all of this. And if you think about it, Lockheed, the fact that they actually sent a plane to take the Ramseys to Atlanta, weren't they also trying to assist in damage control? And the removal of John's bonus is, if you just think about that in a psychological sense, it's theoretically an interesting in-joke as far as I'm concerned. Think of the sale of access to Lockheed in 1997 as a bonus that could be lost if someone wasn't careful. At one point, John also says vaguely, so you don't think about much else, I guess, other than your loss. And I think there is more than one way of interpreting that, including, yes, financial loss. Now, in terms of the legal case, I said I would talk about that briefly. The statute of limitations in terms of the charges John Benet's parents faced, those expired after 3 years. So if you think about it, if you don't know about the charges and the public weren't told how the grand jury voted, and if you're a lawyer and you simply allowed the clock to run down, just allowed enough time to go by, well, that is a quick and easy way to resolve the legal case in your favor if you're a defense lawyer without there being a big media circus surrounding it. It's a very simple way to make the whole thing just go away. The statute of limitations on murder don't expire. It does vary from state to state, but generally it's pretty consistent. But that means that technically this case should still be open. Now, if you want my opinion, I don't think John Benet was murdered. which is murder is the intentional killing of someone. So if she wasn't murdered, then the case really is a legally unresolvable quagmire, because then in reality the statute of limitations don't actually apply here, and where they do, they've expired. Now, it's interesting that the indictment seemed to refer to a third person. I'm not the only one with a background in law who has made that inference. It seems to refer to someone that the Ramseys apparently assisted or were accessories to in a different offense. That's if I'm interpreting the indictments correctly. There's more than one interpretation, I guess, but without actually naming anyone or the offense. Now, I think there's a reason for that as well. And I think this aspect is given unusual legal protections in this case to the Ramseys. It's also something they've capitalized on compared to many other cases we've dealt with, which is why the defense case always has an advantage in this case, in that they can say what they like, whereas there are real legal impediments, unusual handicaps to the prosecution side of the case, where they can't be explicit about who is being charged and for what. It's kind of like you've got both hands tied behind your back. And we've seen what's happened to the media when they do go down that route, the prosecution's case as well. Does that make sense? I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.